This is the Trojan nuclear plant, located about 45 miles northwest of Portland. Every year, thousands of kids from across Oregon are encouraged to visit Trojan, the only nuclear power plant in the state. Portland General Electric, the utility that operates Trojan, takes great pride in the plant's Visitor Information Center. Inside are exhibits proclaiming nuclear power as a clean, safe source of energy.
Clean to make, clean to use. That's electricity generated from nuclear energy. Nuclear power is a clean source. Here at Trojan, that includes clean air, clean water, and clean natural surroundings.
But there's more to the Trojan story than bright lights and flashy images. Behind the glossy promotion is a story of numerous safety violations that have occurred since the plant began operating in 1975. The most serious violation, discovered in the summer of 1989, led to a record fine from the Nuclear Regulatory Commission.
The federal government has fined Trojan's operator, PGE, nearly $300,000 for failing to identify and correct a problem that could have led to a major accident. The Nuclear Regulatory Commission levied a fine after inspectors found 2 pumps that were inoperative.
These NRC inspectors who stay on site at the plant discovered debris in a sump pump retaining reservoir inside this containment building. The debris could have caused a catastrophe during an accident, but the inspectors say some workers at the plant had no idea it was even dangerous. How is it possible the problem was overlooked for so many years? The NRC inspectors say they were involved with highly technical inspections in other areas of the plant and just hadn't gotten around to the sump pump yet.
Well, what this means is that for 14 years, we were one broken pipe away from Chernobyl.
Portland General Electric responded to the record find with renewed promises to make safety a top priority at Trojan. Federal and state regulators issued harsh warnings.
I'm compelled to tell you that the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, the Siting Council, and the Department believe the Trojan safety program is not what it should and must be. PG's performance falls short of a level that inspires confidence and credibility among the public and Trojan's regulators, in our opinion. In simple terms, PG has to get religion when it comes to safety.
But to some who have fought Trojan's operation for years, such tough talk rings hollow.
There have been a number of instances in which I think the regulatory agencies have had an opportunity to adequately regulate the operation, or at least go in and make a serious examination of what's going on, and in fact that has not occurred. And I don't think it's occurring today.
The discovery of the debris in the emergency core cooling system is only the tip of the iceberg, only the latest safety problem to have sat undetected for years.
Well, come on, all of you big, strong men. Uncle Sam needs your help.
1969, the year of Woodstock. Neil Armstrong made history when he walked on the moon. Richard Nixon became the 37th President of the United States, and Portland General Electric began preparations to build the Trojan nuclear plant. The Northwest economy was booming, and utilities were searching for new sources of energy. For over 30 years, economic growth had been fueled by cheap, abundant electricity generated by the great dams on the Columbia River.
Along Columbia, you can ramble to the sea, but a river, while you're rambling, you can do some work for me.
The hydropower system of the Northwest was the envy of the entire nation, but the region had run out of sites from massive dams like Bonneville and Grand Coulee. In their quest for additional electricity, utilities and the Bonneville Power Administration joined forces in an ambitious project called the Hydrothermal Power Program. The goal, to build 33 nuclear and coal plants by the year 2000. The nuclear power industry was relatively young in 1969. Only 14 nuclear plants were operating in the entire country, and most were only a fraction of the size of Trojan. But nuclear power was on the rise, and to its supporters, it represented the future. Nuclear power was bold, bright, promising, the ultimate answer to solving our energy needs.
Today we are reaching into the core of nature itself for a source of energy so great that 1 ounce of matter can yield enough energy to light this 100-watt bulb for 1 million years. productive use of nuclear power, like the use of all great new things being developed in the United States, depends upon people recognizing a need for it.
When nuclear power came to Oregon, the power brokers brought with them teams with study reports, and they assured us that every conceivable possibility of anything that could go wrong with the plant had been thoroughly examined, thoroughly studied, and they were on top of it. Nothing could go wrong.
What problems, if any, does thermal power plants present in the way of the growing concern over pollution?
Well, in the case of a nuclear power plant, and that's the type of plant that we are going to construct, there really is no pollution, either of air or water. There's no problem at all in air. There's no smokestack or anything like that. There's absolutely no harmful radiation. Matter of fact, a nuclear power plant has less nuclear pollution than a normal steam plant. There's less comes out of the stack. And water pollution, we merely take the water from the river and return it just as pure as we got it.
Ted Halleck, who currently serves on the Northwest Power Planning Council, was a state senator when Trojan was first proposed.
And I think that I was taken, like a lot of Oregonians, by surprise. By that I mean the lay knowledge of nuclear power, I think, was non-existent at that time.
The state of Oregon had no standards or regulations for nuclear plant sites. No state agency had responsibility to oversee PGE's plans.
What we wanted is someone with definitive authority to accept or deny a license for them to operate. At that time, it was sort of an acquiescence. Oh, well, I guess everything's okay, go right ahead.
Oregon Governor Tom McCall created a nuclear siting task force to help determine the proper role of the state in regulating this new source of energy. But the task force was only an advisory group. It had no legal authority. The governor was the only one with the power to stop Trojan's construction. And because Tom McCall believed in nuclear power, some felt the real purpose of the task force was to help generate popular support for Trojan. Such suspicions increased when, in 1971, the legislature learned that political pressure silenced concerns raised by at least one task force member.
We began a series of oversight hearings to try to find out what would be the siting body, what controls would and should they have over Trojan, and so forth and so on. It came, by virtue of us digging for it, it came to the surface that there had been concerns of the state geologist and quite possibly other concerns.
State geologist Raymond Corcoran was a member of the McCall Task Force. In October of 1970, shortly before the task force was to issue its report, Corcoran wrote a 5-page memorandum that outlined the Department of Geology's position on the Trojan site. Corcoran concluded that
the Bechtel report does not, in my estimation, provide enough new geologic data, particularly in regard to faulted structures, to make any reasonably valid determinations as to geologic integrity of the site. Trojan is the first site to be seriously considered for a nuclear power plant in Oregon. The geologic standards that will be set in this instance will become guidelines for future applications.
That report was never issued publicly. It was replaced with another memo, same date, same title.
The Department of Geology received the geological report done for Portland General Electric by the Bechtel Company and consultants John B. Ivey and Howard A. Coombs. Because of the limitations of the staff and facilities, the Department of Geology is not in a position to submit an opinion of the Trojan site. We will accept the opinions of the U.S. Geological Survey. This is nonsense. This is absolute nonsense. Mr. Corcoran has had a thorough report by Mr. Groh. Mr. Corcoran, prior to the Groh report, has expressed his concern to Governor McCall. Mr. Corcoran, or whomever wrote for Mr. Corcoran, this lengthy 5-page single-spaced document, as Joe McCarthy used to say, which I have here in my hand, then turns out a 2-paragraph double-spaced statement. Gee, I've got nothing to say.
In 1972, the Trojan controversy made the front page of the Wall Street Journal. Corcoran denied that he had been under any pressure to rewrite his report. In fact, he even denied the existence of the original memo. But it was discovered years later, along with another document buried in the Department of Geology's files. This letter to Ed Westerdahl, Governor McCall's executive assistant, provides valuable insight on the political climate of the time.
I cannot help but feel that the negative aspects of nuclear power are being more effectively distorted and presented to the public by all media than the less dramatic positive side of nuclear power development. If there is going to be any leadership in correcting this situation, I believe it will have to come from the Executive Office of the Governor, combining the efforts of the Nuclear Siting Task Force, the State Department of Geology, Portland General Electric Company, and those scientists who recognize the essentiality of atomic power development.
The letter was written by Portland businessman Bill DeWeese, at the time a member of the Department of Geology's governing board. Bill DeWeese, strident nuclear power supporter, was state geologist Raymond Corcoran's boss. Ed Westerdahl, prior to his role as McCall's executive assistant, was Portland General Electric's chief legislative lobbyist.
Let's face it, at that time, PGE was all of Oregon, and I presume it's safe to say Portland was controlled by good old boys.
Instead of respectfully disagreeing with those who opposed, their attitude at that point in time was to label everyone who raised any questions as a moron, as a communist, as hypocrites, in any way they could find to justify those charges.
John Haw gained first-hand experience with PGE as a young attorney representing the Oregon Environmental Council in the Atomic Energy Commission's Trojan hearings.
I can say without qualification that the licensing boards as designed at that time and as constituted at that time, as well as the AEC, were nothing but a handmaiden for the nuclear power industry. They were all pro-nuclear. They were all driven by what they perceived to be an impending energy crisis. They all had extremely close ties with the nuclear industry.
Haw worked with geologists Len Palmer and Gil Benson of Portland State University. Palmer and Benson had concerns about potential earthquake faults near the Trojan site, and, like state geologist Raymond Corcoran, they questioned the quality of Bechtel geologists' fieldwork.
And we were concerned that they had, as far as we could tell, never investigated these faults, never looked for them, and never tried to find out whether they were long faults or not. What we found was that they basically were trying to say the least possible. They were making the assumption that the site was good because they already had invested $8 million in site acquisition and investigations without wanting to go in and find out anything that might be a flaw.
Bechtel geologists admitted that they didn't perform several basic geologic tests, but Bechtel didn't back down from their claim that the Trojan site was safe, and as it turned out, they didn't have to. The Atomic Energy Commission, the federal agency charged with protecting public health and safety, had no seismic standards for nuclear power plants at the time. The Trojan Licensing Board used this lack of criteria as their own escape hatch, stating, "A major handicap in resolving this complex issue continues to be the lack of commission seismic criteria." Licensing Board members were free to listen to what they wanted to, and the message they wanted to hear was that the Trojan site was safe.
There was essentially no questioning. There was essentially no opposition. There was essentially no requirement that they fulfill the then recommended procedures for siting a nuclear plant.
The Atomic Energy Commission, persuaded by Bechtel's assurances, gave PGE approval to build Trojan. The Mount St. Helens eruption of May 18, 1980, validated earlier questions and concerns about the quality of Bechtel's geologic work.
And what came out as we started investigating the seismic history of the siting Trojan was a really remarkable parade of quite frightening errors that had been made, or oversights that were permitted to occur.
In 1978, Garrett participated in hearings on nuclear waste storage at Trojan. She tried to bring the results of her research to the attention of federal and state regulators.
When the excavation was being done for the Trojan plant itself, they actually discovered in the area of the excavation shear zones which indicate possible faulting. And some of those shear patterns run actually under the foundation of the Trojan containment building and under the area where the spent fuel pool is located.
And when questioned in the hearings, they said no, they hadn't looked at the length, no, they hadn't looked at the width, no, they hadn't looked at the straightness of the fault, no, they hadn't looked at what kind of material covered it to see how long it had been there and how long buried. And when asked why they hadn't, they said that they had decided that these faults were unimportant, and since they had decided they were unimportant, it wasn't necessary to investigate them.
In a very real sense, the Trojan plant really slipped under the rug in terms of the fact that there were no seismic criteria in place when it was initially sited. And so when we tried, maybe about 7 years later, to raise the issue of what kind of dirt might be under the rug, well, basically no one wanted to look at it. Time and time again, we ran into the stone wall. We weren't being fed accurate information. We knew it. Things weren't being told to us, and we knew it. But we weren't quite sure what it was. We didn't know. We just knew that very often pieces didn't fit together, and there were parts of the puzzle that were being concealed from the public.
Part of that truth, that missing piece to the puzzle, came only days after the waste storage hearings ended, when PGE announced that Trojan's control room did not meet federal earthquake design requirements. There were large gaps inside the control room walls. In some places, reinforcing steel bars were not connected to one another. In other places, bars as big as telephone poles were missing entirely. The entire control building complex had only 1/2 the earthquake resistance capacity that it was required to have. Trojan was in violation of its operating license, and the Nuclear Regulatory Commission ordered PGE to shut the plant down. The shutdown lasted 9 months, and it cost PGE tens of millions of dollars. It also sparked a legal battle between PGE and Bechtel over who would pay for the cost of the extended shutdown and repairs. For 2 years, thousands of pages of testimony were produced in anticipation of a lengthy courtroom drama. But the legal battle ended behind closed doors.
When it came time for the case to go to trial, the lawyers came into the room with the federal judge into his private chambers, and they said, "Judge, we can settle this case and clear your docket and save a 6-month trial. But if the case is to be settled, you need to sign an order which will seal the file so that no one can ever learn who paid what to whom, and you have to order all parties having anything to do with this case, PGE, Bechtel, all the attorneys, all the staff, everyone, to never disclose anything that they've learned about how this plant was built, why these mistakes were made. And you have to sign a document saying that if they ever violate that gag order for as long as they live, they'll go to jail for it."
What PGE and Bechtel were so anxious to hide from the public remained a secret for over 5 years. The cover-up began to unravel when a portion of the documents was leaked to Trojan opponents.
We learned that when the plant was built, Bechtel was building nuclear plants all over the world, and they were expanding so quickly that they ran out of nuclear engineers. So instead of bringing a team of highly trained nuclear engineers like they promised, they went to job shops, which were called in secret testimony the engineering equivalent of Kelly girls. And that's who designed Trojan, the engineering equivalent of Kelly girls.
The engineer assigned to design the control building had failed to make preliminary calculations to determine whether the control room could withstand an earthquake. When the extent of the errors was discovered, he was fired. To correct these serious flaws would have required a fundamental redesign of the plant. But Bechtel, under pressure from PGE to get Trojan built as quickly and cheaply as possible, sacrificed safety for speed.
They brought in a man to fix things, and his name was James Edmonds. The secret testimony told us all we needed to know about Edmonds' qualifications. In that testimony, he was asked, Mr. Edmonds, prior to designing the Trojan nuclear power plant, had you ever before designed a nuclear power plant? And he said no. Had you ever before designed an entire building? Well, no, not an entire building. Prior to designing Trojan, had you ever designed a composite wall for earthquake resistance? No. Had you ever designed a composite wall? No. Prior to designing the Trojan nuclear power plant, sir, had you ever before designed a wall? And James Edmonds said, no.
Edmunds' design calculations sat unchecked for years while Trojan was being built. In a 1981 report, a PGE engineering consultant had this to say about Edmunds' work.
The commitment to use block masonry as the primary earthquake resistance material was the grossest kind of error. To describe this assemblage of masonry and concrete as some unique type of high-strength concrete is similar to trying to pass off a sow's ear as a silk purse. I can conclude only that the designers were either naively ignorant or intellectually dishonest.
Bechtel knew in the early 70s that Trojan was not built to federal regulations, and for years it withheld this information from PGE. But the secret documents appear to show that PGE also knew it had a serious problem long before the company revealed the violation to the public. This letter from Bechtel, dated January 27, 1977, was in response to a PGE request for Bechtel's seismic design calculations for Trojan.
We are unsure whether the transmittal of the raw seismic calculations themselves is in our mutual best interest. These calculations are not self-explanatory in the abstract and would be of very little value to operations and maintenance. On the other hand, there is substantial risk that these calculations, when not accompanied by the assumptions, judgments, and trade-offs associated with them during the design process, could easily mislead one to a wrong conclusion. The long-range effects of such conclusions are very difficult to assess.
The letter goes on to say that rather than having the actual documents physically change hands, that perhaps your boys can get together with our boys and have a little chat, and we'll just leave it at that. In other words, what the letter says is, so you want to know if your nuclear power plant is safe? You want to know if it's going to be damaged or collapse during an earthquake? Believe us, you don't want to know, and we don't want to tell you. The saddest part of it, of course, is that PGE understood the letter perfectly well, and they got the hint, and that's where the paper trail ends.
PGE was alerted to the fact that a serious safety problem existed at Trojan, but it took over a year for the company to announce that its nuclear plant was in violation of its operating license. During this crucial time period, PGE's silence helped the company in another battle it desperately needed to win. This is the spent fuel pool at Trojan, a giant pool designed to temporarily store highly radioactive nuclear waste produced by the plant. PGE originally promised that Trojan's waste would be stored here for only 4 months, then shipped away for burial at a permanent nuclear waste storage facility. Since the 1950s, the nuclear industry has been plagued by the problem of how to dispose of waste that remains radioactive for thousands of years. Government officials and nuclear power supporters have made many promises, but a permanent solution to the problem of nuclear waste still does not exist. As a result, nuclear plants around the country store greater amounts of radioactive waste for much longer periods of time. In 1970, the Oregon Environmental Council tried to raise the question of what would happen with Trojan's waste. To their surprise, they discovered that federal regulators weren't interested in finding the answer.
As interpreted, at least by the AEC, interveners in construction, permit, and siting cases were not permitted to raise the radioactive waste issue. The argument was that we'll take care of that issue later if we need to when it comes around to issuing the operating permit. The problem with that is you wait to discuss the radioactive waste issue until after a plant has been built that has cost hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars. Then the operator says, wait a minute, I've spent all this money, it's not fair to take the permit away from me.
The first time the federal government allowed the radioactive waste issue to be discussed in hearings was in 1978, when PGE sought to increase the amount of waste it could hold in the plant's spent fuel pool.
So after a while, PGE was essentially caught with its pants down after it had been operating for a short period of time, and I guess the management must have realized that there was no place to put the fuel. So what they wanted to do was take these pools that originally had been designed to store 1 year's worth of unloaded waste for no more than about 4 to 6 months, and then store about 10 years worth ultimately in the pools. And of course this is a massive increase in the amount that the pools were designed to handle.
PGE's plan required the approval of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. It was in these NRC hearings that Garrett and others revealed the errors and oversights in the geologic review that occurred when Trojan was initially licensed.
By the time PGE decided that it wanted to store 10 years' worth of nuclear waste on site in what amounted to a tin shed, citizens who were involved in the process were concerned that perhaps it was time to apply the formal siting criteria that were now in place for the siting of nuclear power plants.
Garrett's attempt to raise geologic issues in the hearings was flatly rejected by the NRC.
It was extremely frustrating. We did all we could in good faith. We tried to operate within the systems that then existed, and we felt that we kept getting shined on at every possible opportunity. We just ran into blank wall after blank wall because nobody wanted to look under the rug.
No one had any idea at the time that PGE was sitting on this kind of information. And throughout the spent fuel pool hearings, the interveners were trying to raise geologic issues, and PGE tried to keep the issues out of the hearings. And if they had not gotten the approval to expand the use of the spent fuel pool, Trojan would have had to have been shut down in 1982. They'd have had no place to put the waste. And one has to wonder about the coincidence that 2 days after the hearings are over, after they prevailed, more than a year after they got this letter telling them that the plant's been built all wrong, at that point they first announced, by the way, we have a problem here with the earthquake design of the Trojan nuclear power plant.
The first load of nuclear waste was unloaded into Trojan's spent fuel pool in 1978. In 1984, PGE received approval for the second time to increase the amount of waste it could store at Trojan. The spent fuel pool was originally designed to temporarily hold 70 fuel assemblies. The Nuclear Regulatory Commission has given PGE permission to store over 1,400 assemblies in the same pool for as long as necessary. Today, over 363 tons of radioactive waste is sitting in Trojan's spent fuel pool, with no place to go. Recently, the federal government announced yet another delay in the quest for a permanent waste storage site. We have now been told that it will be the year 2010 at the earliest before a permanent waste repository is built and operating.
We now have 13 years worth of radioactive waste at Trojan. We also now have the promise that there's going to be another 22 years worth of waste that will be produced, which has no place to go. I think that the time has come to make this technology accountable for its problems, and I don't believe that the people of this state should be forced to ultimately accept the waste of a technology that they never were given the initial opportunity to decide that they wanted.
Hundreds of tons of radioactive waste sit 150 feet from the Columbia River at Trojan, at a site where questions regarding seismic safety have never been answered. Those questions have taken on increased importance because of new discoveries about Northwest geology. Recent attention has focused on the Cascadia subduction zone, an area where the North American continental plate meets the Juan de Fuca plate, and a growing body of scientific evidence appears to show that several large subduction zone earthquakes have occurred in the Northwest.
Interesting characteristic about subduction zone earthquakes is that they are among the largest of all recorded earthquakes in the world.
The possibility of a subduction zone earthquake in the Northwest was never considered when Trojan was built. Trojan was designed to withstand a moderate-size earthquake, a 7 on the Richter scale. A magnitude 8 subduction zone earthquake would be 10 times greater than what Trojan was designed to withstand. A magnitude 9 subduction quake would be 100 times greater.
In the hypothetical worst-case situation, everything from Eureka to Vancouver, British Columbia, could be potentially affected to the same degree. That's the very, very worst-case situation, but perhaps half of that area is not at all unrealistic. So we're left with a situation where the potential threat from a subduction zone earthquake is very, very great. The degree of disruption of our lives that would accompany such an earthquake is absolutely unprecedented in modern history from natural disasters.
Many state and local government officials are concerned about the region's lack of planning for a large subduction zone earthquake.
The part of preparation for an earthquake, it strikes me, is how susceptible is your friendly nearby nuclear power plant to being destroyed or melted down or busted open or leaking its contents into the Columbia River or whatever if there is a serious quake.
Four Laws on Board attempted to have that question addressed. In 1988, FOB petitioned the State Energy Facility Siting Council to hold a contested case hearing on the potential impact of a large subduction zone earthquake on Trojan.
All we're asking is that you hold a proceeding to examine the evidence, and that proceeding have the power to give the individuals who participate an opportunity to test and weigh that evidence, and at the end of that proceeding, you have the power to take action, which would relate directly to the license, the site certificate that has been given to the Trojan nuclear plant.
The Siting Council chose a more informal process. It referred the issue to a subcommittee, which held one meeting. A team of PGE consultants tried to dismiss all fears that any earthquake could harm Trojan.
They said that, lo and behold, when they had constructed the Trojan nuclear plant, they in fact had built it to withstand a subduction zone earthquake. And that's obviously false because, you know, there was no knowledge of a subduction zone earthquake, but they were making a case that there were design conservatisms that were automatically built into the plant. So we asked the Siting Council at that point, or the Siting Council members that were there, if we could cross-examine PGE's witnesses, and they said no.
Based upon PGE's promises and assurances, which were not under oath nor subject to cross-examination, the Siting Council denied Four Laws on Board's petition and decided to take no action except to require PGE to monitor future developments. In case of an accident or earthquake at Trojan, we depend on the plant's emergency core cooling system to shut the plant down safely. However, debris such as scaffolding, tools, and welding rods were recently discovered in the emergency system. This debris may have been there since the plant first began operating. In other words, the emergency core cooling system might never have worked. When the debris was discovered, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission fined PGE a record $280,000.
What occurred here was a situation in which apparently, even though they had quality assurance programs and they were sending inspectors, supposedly sending inspectors down to take a look at this, they were filing falsified reports, or they were filing reports saying that inspections had taken place which had not actually occurred.
At this hearing which followed the debris discovery, legislators learned of PGE's consistently poor safety performance.
I think it is fair to say that by the nuclear power industry's own performance standards, Trojan was on the low end of the scale in the late 1970s. Performance improved over the next few years, but never was better than the industry average. Then in 1986 and 87, performance began to slide despite PGE's stated goal that Trojan performance would be among the industry leaders. From our view, the basis for the fine illustrates the disparity between the quality of Trojan management that PGE has continually pledged to deliver and that which actually has been delivered.
This safety violation follows a familiar pattern. The problem is announced, the regulators levy some fines, the utility promises that it'll never do it again, and then the whole issue dies down and we're back to business as usual.
20 years ago, Trojan was a highly acclaimed Oregon first that was going to lead the state into the atomic age. But in the 1970s, Oregonians became concerned about the environmental impact, nuclear safety, and skyrocketing costs of nuclear power plants. Trojan became the focus of a growing anti-nuclear movement. Almost 500 people were arrested in 3 demonstrations at the Trojan plant. The movement played a major role in raising public awareness about the dangers of nuclear power. In 1980, voters approved a ballot measure which prohibits the construction of additional nuclear plants in Oregon until a permanent solution to the nuclear waste problem is found. Trojan, an Oregon first, had also become an Oregon last. In November 1990, Oregonians will vote on a ballot measure that would shut down the Trojan plant until a permanent nuclear waste repository is built and operating, and an independent review determines the plant can safely withstand major earthquakes. In 1986, Portland General Electric spent almost $3 million to defeat a similar measure.
4 years ago, we ran a generic anti-nuclear campaign. We said all nuclear plants are dangerous, Trojan's a nuclear plant, it should be shut down. What we didn't know 4 years ago in the 1986 campaign was that the plant had been built all wrong. What we didn't know 4 years ago was that the emergency core cooling system was clogged with debris and had been clogged since the day the plant opened. 4 years ago, we didn't know the full scope of the Chernobyl disaster.
I am very concerned about what appears to be a double standard. We have people really made a very deep outcry against Hanford as a potential long-term facility to store nuclear waste because of the danger to the Columbia River and to our lives. But we have a potential danger right here in our own backyard. The Trojan nuclear plant has been storing nuclear waste now for 13 years in the spent fuel pool, which is about 100 feet from the Columbia River, and the potential of an accident there has a much higher chance of impacting our health and safety here in the Portland area.
When you examine all the problems at Trojan, you will find that Portland General Electric is asking the people of the Pacific Northwest to bear a tremendous risk in exchange for a resource that only provides 3% of the total amount of power that's produced in this region. In addition, the costs of shutting down the Trojan nuclear plant are minimal. When you look at the amount of power that this company sells on a firm basis to California and the amount of cogeneration that's available from their large industrial customers, all of which could be used to replace this plant's output, and at an economic cost. We can live without Trojan.
In the 20 years since Trojan was first proposed, we've learned of political pressure used to squash legitimate scientific concerns. We now know that Trojan was never designed to withstand a major earthquake. We know of deliberate cover-ups of sloppy construction work that violated federal regulations. We've seen promises of a permanent solution for the storage of radioactive waste repeatedly broken, and if there had ever been a serious accident at Trojan, the emergency core cooling system would probably not have worked. It's not a record Portland General Electric is proud of, and if you visit the Trojan Information Center, you're not likely to see any exhibits about the untold story of Trojan.
Clean to make, clean to use. That's electricity generated from nuclear energy. Nuclear power is a clean source. Here at Trojan, that includes clean air, clean water, and clean natural surroundings.